Good people. Thank you. Okay, we're about to start the meeting of the City Council's Infrastructure Committee. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Berman.
Here.
Councilmember Burt.
Here.
Chair Klein.
Here.
Councilmember Scharf.
Here.
4 present.
Okay. And our first item is oral communications, where anybody may address us on any item which is not on the agenda, but which is within our purview. So do we have anybody? We have no cards on that. Seeing none, we will move to our one and only agenda item, which is to review the infrastructure survey findings and recommendations and provide direction to staff on next steps. And we have one member of the public who wishes to speak to us on this item, and I think we'll hear from him now. If there are other members of the public who would like to speak to us, please fill out one of these pieces of paper and give it to the city clerk. Mr. Borak?
Thank you. Chair Klein, good morning, everybody. I'd like to speak briefly of 3 things about the potential revenue side on the next steps. As I've mentioned to this committee before and to the council, I think it would make sense to have a ballot measure on the utility users tax, so that all ratepayers will pay a 5% rather than the current way it is in the code for 26 years, where the largest customers pay a lower percentage on their higher usage amounts. The consultant indicated to you that if there were a couple of ballot measures on at the same time, those that had received the lowest amount of support were defeated. However, in the terms of utility users tax, it was just the opposite. In fact, experience had been that those taxes generally passed, and so they didn't even bother polling on that. So I think that wouldn't have that problem of having 2 measures on the ballot. The second thing is, I believe that it should be a general tax rather than a special tax, because general tax requires just the majority vote. And the third, if there is a general tax, I don't think there should be an accompanying advisory vote indicating what the voters thought the money might be used for. First, it's not binding, and secondly, it would provide a target for no votes. That is, always going to be a certain number of people who will be voting against any kind of revenue measure, any kind of taxes. But if you provide a target such as that of saying, well, it's going to be used for this particular thing, it would provide a way for people to coalesce against it. So it would be just a suggestion would be, in summary, general taxes to be raised, and that that amendment to utility users tax should be one of the measures on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will return the item now to the committee. Sheila,
yes, Jim wanted to make some.
he was here. I saw him.
Thank you, Sheila Tucker, Assistant to the City Manager. Before we get started, I just want to say this is my last meeting, and I really enjoyed serving this committee over the past year, and how much of a pleasure it's been. I look forward to hopefully in November of 2014 being able to sit here in Palo Alto and watch some election returns.
I know we've all enjoyed working with you. Well, it's not like you're moving to some other state. So
Nope.
We're looking forward to some interaction with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So just a brief staff presentation on a couple of items. Just for the benefit of the public, could remind you we were all before the council in December 9th, with the findings of our second infrastructure survey. We have Dave Metz from Fairbanks here this morning to answer any questions that might come up on the survey findings. I will say, though, at a very high level, the transient occupancy tax came back as a very high chance for success, I think at approximately 79%. followed by the sales tax and a potential geo bond on transportation that looked potentially viable. If we were to proceed, though, in those either of those two areas, we would want to do a little bit more polling on pro and con arguments to help shape a potential communication campaign. We put together just a brief staff report. At the December 9th meeting, we had some input from council members in a wide variety of areas, but we kind of focused in on 5 in particular. Would like to make a few remarks about a few of the items. The first of which, attachment or packet page 177 has a memo from Fairbanks, Maslin, and Mullen. I'd like to ask Dave to come up just briefly and speak to some afterthoughts, really, that didn't get discussed at the council meeting about an advisory measure, as well as just to recap the response to placing multiple measures on a ballot.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm Dave Metz. I'm a partner with Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen, Metz & Associates. On the 2 subjects that Sheila raised, first, the notion of having an advisory measure to accompany a general tax that would raise funds for the city. Our experience has been generally that that structure entails a fair amount of risk in that the advisory measure will talk about the kinds of services to be funded, won't have a tax associated with it directly, and generally is therefore very appealing to people who are seeing it on the ballot. Whereas the subsequent measure that's a general tax doesn't have any link in its ballot language to the one that preceded it, will not reference the kinds of services that are going to be funded, and therefore, and will entail a tax, and is therefore less appealing to potential voters. So unless the connection between the two is very clear in voters' minds, there's a tendency for them to vote no on the tax and yes on the advisory measure, which seems to promise all kinds of good things. There have been a number of communities where that dynamic has ended up resulting in a loss for the tax measure. And essentially what it means is that the burden is on there being a private citizen-funded campaign that could advocate for the 2 measures and make the connection between them clear. I also pointed out in some of the research that I shared with you at the City Council meeting that the League of California Cities has investigated this structure and looked at all of the cities that have used it over the course of the last couple of years and found that it does not provide any significant advantage in securing the passage of a general tax measure. I'll defer to my colleagues, Charles and Amanda from TBWB as well, if they have different perspectives, but our sense is that that strategy would probably entail more risks than rewards. On the second item, in terms of having multiple items on the same ballot, the sense we have is that a utility users tax modernization is likely to be successful. We haven't polled on it, but I believe the rate of passage for these measures, I think only one of them has failed, particularly if it entails a rate reduction along with the modernization. So those measures typically do very, very well. And the potential to put both a UUT modernization and a revenue measure on the same ballot is probably there without necessarily undermining the success of either one. Having multiple revenue measures on the ballot, however, at the same time, is likely to result in reducing the prospects for success of the measure that fares less well in terms of voter support. There's only one measure among the 5 concepts that we tested in our most recent poll, the transient occupancy tax, that is receiving a level of support so far in excess of the threshold required for approval that it looks like it might be able to withstand that. Any of the other options that you might pair with it that we tested in the prior poll, either of the bond measures, a Mello-Roos district for parking, or the sales tax, are close enough calls that it looks like it could potentially undermine the success of that second measure. So our recommendation to you would be that while you might pair a revenue measure with the UUT modernization, we would not recommend proceeding with multiple revenue measures on the same ballot.
Thank you, Dave. So,
Any questions, Mr. Metz?
sure.
Not required.
On other things, yes. Not on this. I mean, if we're getting into the conversation.
Well, let's staff.
We had just a few more remarks we wanted to make. But
So, if we paired a sales tax revenue with the TOT, are you recommending against that? Because the sales tax measure would likely lose, and you'd end up with just the TOT.
I wouldn't go so far as to say it would likely lose, but I think it would be placed in significant jeopardy, yes. So I would recommend against that.
Page 27. Back of page 27. 26.
Just wanted to follow up. You spoke pretty pointedly on that the information is that these advisory measures do not seem to help passing the general general purpose taxes. That's somewhat of a surprise. We've been told for years that cities have been doing this, that it's a good practice. We have done such things in the past. So you're clear that all that information in the past has really not been proven out by historical analysis. Is that correct?
I can't speak to where those other recommendations came from, but the League of California Cities report, which we provided you, does come to that conclusion, and it is not that frequent a practice right now. I think there were only, in the decade that they looked at, 6 or 7 cities that had used that structure. It was more in vogue, I would say, about 10 years ago, but hasn't been utilized as often since.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So moving along, we would like to invite Molly Stump, City Attorney, to come up and report on the UUT and some information we didn't have at the time related to combining multiple issues on a UUT modernization.
Thank you, Sheila, Chair Klein, council members. So when we prepared the report, we had not completed our look at the options for addressing the UUT modernization, which we've done now, and can report to you that if the council does wish to move forward with both a language modernization on the telephone tax portion of the UUT and also address the large volume discount, either change it or get rid of it, you can go ahead and do that on a single ballot measure. It obviously would affect the way you would describe the way that measure would appear to voters on the ballot, but those two could be combined into one UUT ballot item. If the council preferred, you could break it into 2, or you could do one or the other, but you do have all of those options available to you.
Okay. Thank you, Molly. And then just lastly, obviously the staff report just focuses on some of the issues that were brought up and the survey findings as it relates to what we might proceed with in a November 2014 election. But really the other pieces of the puzzle are the project costs and the project prioritization. And I just, although it's not covered in the staff report, would direct your attention to packet page 26 and 27. 26 does give an update on where we are on the project cost. 27 looks at the revenue that we have both from existing resources as well as what would be yield from the potential new finance measures. And then finally, I would call your attention to packet page 42, which looks at some funding scenarios that we put together and how those might be combined, particularly related to TOT, where we look at the 2 and 3%. I would call out that there were some funding assumptions that we made at that time that are no longer today, in particular the digital reader board revenue, which we have since then decided not to proceed with. And then lastly, I would like to just to defer to Joe here too as well for some comments about unexpected infrastructure cost that we always want to be mindful of, I think, as we're looking at relying on our infrastructure reserve to potentially fund our needs.
So there's nothing really specific, but even though the committee's done great work in defining the projects that are out there, and we are still we heard very preliminarily about potential costs that the general fund might be have to loan for the airport. This hasn't really come forward yet, but also, the golf course is going to come before you, and there could be some potential vulnerabilities there on the financing. So it's just to keep in mind that as we all know, there are a lot of demands on the general fund and potentially on reserve. So as we go forward with this, just to make the council cognizant that there could be other drawers in the future on general fund resources that may come from the IR or wherever. It's just a general point.
Thank you.
Well, I was going to say anything, but it's on. just given that, just to put things in context from my point of view, as a committee and the IBRIC and others know, we've been assessing our needs for quite some time, and we have a very long list of needs, potential needs, more than any particular funding measure that we could advance right now. We've also, though, been able to identify other funding sources outside of a measure. So that clearly will have to be necessary to addressing our infrastructure needs. My own view at this point in time would be we shouldn't so much look at this at the moment as to what infrastructure need do we want to fund, say, with, and then therefore identify the measures, but invert it the other way and say, what's the possibility for a measure to supplement other funding that we may want to use to go to our infrastructure, and then based upon, if you make that decision, let's just say TOT, then I think you want to sort of structure and identify the kind of projects that would also, again, most make sense as far as the measure being able to be successful and that the city would need, because we would still, I can't see any of the recommendations right now solving all of our infrastructure needs with some ballot measure revenue stream that comes in. So it's going to be a combination of the two. So I think if we look at it that way, it's easier for the committee to reach some conclusions as it relates to revenue measures, just given the fact that it's now January and November is much closer than when we started. Thanks.
I'm not sure I follow that. Let me pick up from what Joe said, because I certainly agree that this is always going to be a moving target. Things change. The cost may be increasing, and maybe we're moving into it, or some other project comes along that we hadn't anticipated right now. On the other hand, we have more revenue than we did a year ago. We had surplus from the 2013 fiscal year, which we added to our calculations. And whether that's going to be true for fiscal 14 seems that way, but we'll find out. Then we have the Parks and Recreation Commission saying that they're not really very interested in developing the playing fields of the golf course. And we haven't taken any action on that, but that's another new data point. So all that says to me is there's always going to be a certain amount of shifting around on this. But I didn't understand where you lead us to on that.
Okay.
Because here, if we put a measure on the ballot, whether it's a sales tax or the transit occupancy tax, or I'm not going to be unrealistic. I think those are the only two candidates. And one way or another, we're going to tell the public what we're going to be spending the money on. Mm-hmm. Would there be a caveat that says this thing's going to be changed? Are you disagreeing with that?
No, I'm not. I was just trying to make sure that, I guess I'm feeling that the clock is ticking, and that rather than us saying, do we need a public safety building, how much does that cost, and then therefore what revenue do we need to fund that, to just forget that. Say we have some non-tax measure revenue available, and I'm presuming that that's not enough to fund all of our infrastructure needs. And so therefore, how do you bring in another revenue stream? What's the best possible revenue stream to bring into our infrastructure picture? And let's just say it's TOT. And you say in the TOT could yield whatever, depending upon the amount, $30 to $40 million in financing or whatever the number
Jim,
is.
it's 65 to 73.
Okay, sorry, 65.
65 to 80.
No.
That counts the new revenue as well.
Right.
It counts the new revenue
Right.
as well.
He's talking about the.
But I'm just talking about the TOT.
I thought it was I thought it was the TOT increase on the new if you include the new hotels.
That's not what
It's,
he's referring to.
yeah, no,
Tax measure.
if you did the tax
Right.
measure, it's 30.8 million to 46.2 million is the yield.
You're counting the new revenue from
Right,
hotels.
from new hotels. So which we would have regardless.
Right.
So all my point is just saying, okay, if we were to say we're going to bring $46 million in there, once you make that decision, then we would start to say, okay, how would we describe to the public what we would spend that on? I mean, let's make the decision that way as opposed to the other way around. And I just think it's a quicker way to get to a decision about what you want to put on the ballot or you don't, unless somehow you were to conclude, I'm not in this camp, but that you could fund all of the city's infrastructure needs without any measure going on the ballot.
I guess we're moving into discussion.
I wanted to clarify because Joe's point raised the same concern for me, which is we're always going to have things adjusting and coming in and you know, impacting what we need to do. And so the faster we nail down what we want to do here on some of this infrastructure funding streams and what we want to spend it on, then the easier it is for us to start solving those infrastructure problems.
All right. Before we start discussion, questions from the committee, in some ways I think the agenda has been set for us by the 4 questions that the staff asks on pages 1 and 2. And I think there may be other ones as well. And one that here are 2 that I have, 3 that I've written down, and others may have other ones to add. My first one was, I think, similar to what Jim was saying. Do we want to develop a list of the projects in priority order that we want to fund from one source or another? Second, what do we do about the public safety building? Is this included in this or not? And thirdly, we need to develop a timetable? For example, do we want to have a date by which we want to have a report to the full council? So before we move on to other things, are there other questions that committee members feel that we need to answer either today or very soon? Greg?
So there's a couple, I assume the public safety building includes the whole discussion about if that's included in a plan of how we'd get that done and talk about that. So I just wanted to make, if that's broad like that, then I'm good with that as part of the discussion. And I think I would like us to go back and look a little bit at what the IBRIC did and what they talked about and close the loop on that and say, how much money do we actually need, and do we have it as part of when we do the list of priorities?
Oh, that to me is the same thing.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that we're...
Well, you've added to go back and look at the IBRIC report, too.
I just want to close the loop on the whole process and say to the IBRIC, this is what we looked at, this is what comes out of it, this is the measure that goes, and this is the funding plan. And when we talk about a list of priorities, I'm thinking of a funding plan for where we are in terms of infrastructure and what we're not going to do and what we are going to do.
Yes. Mark, Pat?
So I'm pretty aligned there. What I think I heard from Jim is that we could look at this from a bottom-up or a top-down kind of calculation of what are our total needs and how would we meet that versus what's our revenue potential and what could it buy. I actually think that I'm more inclined to a hybrid of those. One is that when we look at the summary on packet page 42, which is, I think, still, I wish we'd had a little more of an updated scenario, and I'll kind of offer a straw man discussion of what I think might be a useful scenario that could then be modified further. But we're not that far from having funds available through a pretty obtainable measures that would be adequate to meet the list of priority projects. And I think that we should try to, I wish we had, we still don't even have a whiteboard here, but if we had that updated scenario, and I'll if it's okay, I'll offer for discussion purposes a few assumptions, which others could say, no, I don't want to use that assumption. For me, the public safety building and fire stations are top priorities. Pretty close behind that is addressing parking needs downtown, but what I see here is 2 downtown garages and a Cal Ave garage of cost equivalent to 2 downtown garages. So that I don't know what assumptions are there, but I'm hesitant to commit to kind of the upper end of what we might consider long-term on garages prior to seeing how much we can accomplish through TDM programs. So do we just build more parking spaces, or do we recognize we need some more parking spaces, but we want to reduce that demand as aggressively as possible through means that also reduce traffic and have other benefits. And then we have, but if we were to just dial that back some, like 1 downtown garage and half the cost on Cal Ave garage, then we're getting in the neighborhood of $130 million in those expenses. When I look at things like the park catch-up, some of these things were put in this list because they were attractive in polling, not because necessarily they were at the top of community needs or council established priorities, which are hopefully pretty well aligned. And so I think we want to go back, and if we're no longer being driven by trying to put a general fund measure that would have the highest polling support, but instead what we think is the most achievable and fairest in a general fund measure that would be well received by the community, and what projects we could do. So I'll also add that I'm not inclined to include the infrastructure reserve in the funding sources. I think that should be a reserve. But it also may be that we take off some of these projects that would be funded through our normal infrastructure. I'm not inclined to include the 5 years annual surplus. That again, I think those dollars, if and when they happen, can take on some of these second-tier infrastructure initiatives, like what portion of the parks and sidewalks or whatever. We might do some nearer term and some longer term. But I do think that we have enough visibility, as Larry had talked about, on the 2014 surplus that maybe we would still be conservative, but we plug in a number for a 2014 surplus into this calculation as well, and in a way that's going to come close to offsetting the 5-year annual surplus inclusion. So that nets out. I just wouldn't use a 5-year surplus assumption. I would use something that is within our sights on the conservative side. And I come up with and for my purposes, I'm considering a 2% transient occupancy tax or hotel tax increase. And with those things, I'm coming up with around $130 million. And we can achieve the vast majority of our infrastructure priorities between the new hotel revenues, the back rent for the police building, the Stanford funds, and the increase in the TOT along with our 2-year surplus. This doesn't look like we've got such a gap that we're going to have to struggle with. This is, in my mind, pretty good news, and I'd like to see if we can move through that discussion. Are we closer to consensus on that kind of model? And maybe others have very different thoughts on that.
Mark?
Well, the first thing I have is a question for staff, which is on, we lost the scenario on the sales tax in the new staff report, and I'm not sure why that got dropped from the options, but I look at 42, 43 of the new staff report, and sales tax isn't on there, when I've been kind of working by our December staff report just because that's one that I marked up back then. where we have the sales tax there as an option. So was that just an omission, or was that intentional, and if so, why, or what happened there?
Right. Yeah, you're correct. We did not update the scenarios to include sales tax.
And was that?
I think, well, I think for one reason, it wasn't until we retested sales tax that it became viable. I mean, initially it pulled very in the 40s.
No, I know, but
Right.
in the December staff report, we have potential infrastructure project funding scenario number 2, which was after the new polling, is an option, and I think it's a good option that we need to discuss today vis-a-vis the TOT increase, and that's not there. I know what you're saying about how first it didn't poll well, but that's not.
So
It's-
just kind of cutting to the chase, it's a really good point, but we're talking about the 1/8 of a cent sales tax. Was that the?
Or 1/4 of a cent, eighth or quarter.
So 1/8 of a cent is $3.6 million bucks or something.
36.4.
It's 36.4 is the yield. So I don't mean to say it, but it's fairly close to what the 2% TOT is, right?
Correct. 1/4 cent sales tax is significantly more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 72.8.
So it's pretty simple for you to add that in, though. Now, I mean, you know what I mean. We could add
Sure,
another
but if it's not in the staff report, it's we might forget about it and not discuss it, and it's not an option that we're analyzing. So it doesn't make sense to me why that was left out, and I think it's something that we need to. Needs to be part of our discussion. In regards to Pat's comments, I agree that we're really close, and depending on which revenue measure we choose. Between the new revenue measure and the new funding sources that we've identified over the past year, and depending on if we drop some projects off. I disagree a little bit. I think the projects that were included were a lot of the projects that were on the IBRIC report. So it's not necessarily totally because they're popular. In fact, I think one of these on here might be very unpopular and merits further discussion as to whether it should be on there or not, which is the Charleston or Astrodero plan. And yeah. But I think part of my goal as a former IBRIC member has always been finding ways to fund as many of those projects as possible. But we can definitely, I'm definitely open to discussions as to which ones should or shouldn't be on there. I had some questions. I don't know at what level of, I don't know where we are in the conversation and how much I should throw all of my questions out and comments out, or. Yeah.
If I could just interject for just a moment, Councilmember Berman, packet page 159 does include a scenario for the sales tax, both at 1/4 cent and 1/8 cent. Packet page 159 from our previous staff report.
So,
Okay.
which is great. So I just don't know why that wasn't in the new one.
I know.
Because if we've got one here, we're not even going to get to 159 in the report. So I just want to make sure that those, that folks on the committee, including new folks on the committee, know that we did have a sales tax scenario that merits discussion. I had a question for Dave Metz, actually, that didn't have to do with his earlier presentation. But it kind of goes to what Jim was talking about, and I think part of the discussion we're going to have, which is when I was looking at the 3 viable options that have been identified, the TOT, the sales tax, and a transportation bond, the projects that we identify in the wording for the TOT and the sales tax are practically identical in regards to focusing on general city services such as police patrols, 9/11 emergency response, et cetera, et cetera. And then the projects for the transportation bond are to provide safe routes to school for children, improve accessibility for people with disabilities, provide a network of safe bike paths and pedestrian walkways, increase the availability of parking. It focuses more on parking, transportation, traffic, those types of things. A debate that I've been having in my mind is what do people react to? Do they react to the funding vehicle, a tax or a bond or what have you, or do they react to the projects that are going to be funded? And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I think the answer, of course, is both.
Yeah.
I think the sort of synthesis of the two is what yields you a level of support. And in our first poll, you'll remember we sort of isolated where the money would go and where it would come from so we could test those variables independently. What we find when we combine them is the differences become less stark. You know, some people are willing to bear the tax because they like where the money is going to go. Some people may be supportive of getting more money for city services, even if not everything on the list is something that they would support.
If it comes from perceived to be outside sources.
Right.
Kind of
there may be a certain mechanism like the TOT where they say, hey, it's no skin off my back. Even if the project list isn't perfect, I'm not going to be paying the full cost of it.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the poll, the reason the language was different was we were framing the TOT and the sales tax as general taxes. So we wanted to list as examples a wide range of city services that could potentially be funded. For the bond measure, by its nature, it's going to require a 2/3 vote, and therefore we could be very specific about the range of transportation projects that would be funded.
So a question for you, and it might be a question for Molly as well, is, I mean, to what extent could we, I don't think anybody would disagree that traffic and parking are the main issues on our residents' minds, and I think given the new situation around the public safety building, which we'll discuss at some point today, that probably shouldn't be a focus of whatever revenue generating measure we're going to put on the ballot, just because it's much more uncertain. We don't even have a site. And so, which I think we need to work on, but we'll get to that. So I think it would make sense. I mean, I think the description of the transportation bond measure is probably more in line with the priorities that we might have, and the types of projects that we'd like to fund with a TOT or a sales tax measure. And I'd be curious to see how voters would react to the essentially to the transportation bond measure description, but matched with the other funding vehicles. So that might be something that I'd want to discuss today and get my colleagues' thoughts on. And I don't know if there's any reason why we couldn't do that, Molly. Whether maybe we have to rephrase things to make them a little more vague, but focusing more on transportation, traffic, parking issues.
I don't see the legal question. We're only talking about surveys. We can ask anything we want in the survey.
True, but we'd want it to be something that yes.
Sure. So there's a couple different pieces to this, and City Attorney can speak to this more precisely. But in terms of taking the language we had for the transportation bond and applying it to the general tax options, my sense is that wording would read far too much like a specific tax, even if we broadened it to just be transportation purposes. Since that's not the lion's share of city services, it would still, I would suspect, read like a special tax, but that is a legal question. The other thing, and my colleague Charles reminded me of this as well, that I should mention, is I was talking before about the advisory measure and how we don't typically recommend that approach. Another approach that the city could choose to take is to legislatively approve an expenditure plan in advance of the election, where you as a city council say, should the voters approve this measure, here is how we intend to spend the money, so that voters could go to the ballot with full knowledge of what the council's intent is.
Gotcha.
Now, it's not binding. Any future council could change its mind and spend the money a different way if the measure is a general tax. But it at least creates a political context where your intent is clear, you're on the record, and the voters can hold you to that.
But it doesn't go to the ballot. It's a bit of a compromise.
It doesn't appear on the ballot. The burden would still be on a campaign, should one form, to communicate that to the voters. But it would be a formal record of the council's intent. And so you could use a general tax to fund the same set of purposes listed in the transportation bond measure, with that expenditure plan, but it would not be legally binding.
Yep. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that those are kind of the initial questions and comments that I have, I guess, at this point as we dig deeper into the details.
Okay.
So, was there a difference in the polling between a 2% and a 3% increase? And what was your take on that?
There was a difference. It was relatively modest. Essentially, we started by presenting people with a 3% TOT increase. And if we look at the percentage of respondents who initially were not firmly in favor of it, but once we reduced the rate to 2%, said they would be, it gained us about 7 points in support. Now, our initial support was already at a level where we were over the 2/3 threshold, let alone a simple majority threshold. So it doesn't seem like for that measure the rate would be determinative in whether the measure would succeed, unless you decided to pursue it as a special tax, at which point then it might help.
All right. So I had some questions for staff. I mean, I got the sense that outreach is critical, and there was some list here about things we need to do and next steps. And so I guess I wanted to know is what you're hoping we'll accomplish today. I mean, the sense I got was that we should tell you what measures we want on the ballot and then have you go out and do the outreach. Was that what you were looking for from the committee today?
Correct. I think, as we look forward to a potential November 2014 measure, we're at a point where we need to be making some decisions about what we would proceed. We wouldn't be asking necessarily for a final no-go decision, but we would be looking for some strong direction in proceeding with outreach to begin to educate and engage the community on what we're pursuing. We would come back, and we would anticipate coming back in late spring, early summer to do a final poll to see where we're at, and at that point, council would make a policy decision on whether to place the measure on the ballot.
And then if we went with the TOT, I'm having a hard time seeing why we would need to do any more polling at this point.
That is correct. That is correct.
It's smarter to just move on and get this done, do the outreach. So staff doesn't disagree with that.
We agree, and I think we have BWB here as well as Dave, that the polling results are as high as they are. We would not proceed with any polling. On some of the other measures, because we had so much to test in this last survey, we didn't get a chance to test a lot of pro and con arguments, and so we would want to do some additional polling around those types of things to help shape a communication campaign.
And then it seems to me that one of the other issues we have is, do we do the advisory measure? We did have council direction to do that, but do we recommend to council, given the new information, that we do, what do we call it, a legislative expenditure plan instead? And I think we need to probably make that decision as a committee and then go back to council on that, if that's what we choose to do. And then I guess the other question is, Pat brought up what's included and what's not. I'm not sure we need to make that decision today. I think there's a lot of questions around that issue. I think there's a lot of information we might need to go looking back and see what other items there were, what exactly some of these items mean. I need to refresh my recollection. What is parks catch-up exactly? I'm not sure I remember what the details on that were. So do we need to, I guess that was my question, is that a decision, when does that decision need to be made of what's included and what's not? And that would go in that legislative action plan or on the ballot, I assume. So I assume that decision the committee has some time to talk about and think about, but I was curious.
Well, if I just, I hadn't had a recent conversation with the staff about this sort of outreach period. I mean, as I understand this, it's a way of sort of trying to pre-test with the community the tentative decisions both on the revenue measure and projects themselves and how the projects would be positioned, and to do that so that before you finalize something, then you could sort of have had the benefit of sort of, we'd have some extra data out there, and that sort of a thing. What was your question again? I'm sorry, got lost in mine.
My question was, there's a list of projects that we've been talking about that we went through. I think there's a lot of discussion around a lot of them that probably need to take place.
Yeah. So my thinking is, and it's a little bit what my intro comment was that I think is going to have to, out of necessity, get refined during this outreach period for us to really be sure that it not only is it understandable, but that where we might be with those projects are viable. I mean, just give you an example. The public safety building, we have an issue now of where would the land be for the public safety building, and if we don't have some ways to be able to effectively answer that, I think that could become an issue if you were to want to sort of do a measure at least that was somehow funding it. And if people said, well, where would you put this thing? And we say, well, we don't have any idea. Then that might have some impact on whether or not people would say, well, should we support something related to that? I'm just saying, you know, in the case of the TOT, it probably doesn't make a difference per se, just given the way the numbers are. But as far as our credibility about what we're going to be talking about, what we're doing, we want to make sure. And I think that's one of the larger questions that's in there also for the council is, it's a little bit what I was trying to draw up there in this bad diagram, is how much of the infrastructure problem or needs that we have as a city do you want to feel that you are addressing?
All of it, Jim.
Okay,
All of it.
so that's the question. No, if somehow you're saying you want to have an answer for all of it, regardless, I mean, some of it's going to be this, some of it's going to be that, some of it may be, you know, we thought that was an important project, but it's not anymore, as opposed to having loose ends out there. It seems to me, I think that's an important decision, because I still think that there's the possibility that there may be some projects that would need to be dropped off as one way to be solving the whole problem. Let's just take the Charleston Rasadero for what I just as a convenient one. Even though that's been around for a while, you very well may decide that shouldn't be even in the list, and that's part of the way of getting to whatever the number is. Let's just say it's 150 million. You say, we're going to solve this much with new revenue, we're going to solve this much. To what extent do you feel you want to tell the public, we have really taken care of the infrastructure issue? And to the extent that you do that, I think you're going to want to test how that plays with the public. Did that really, is 150 million, is that it? If you do these things and that's it, does that, do people say you've done what you've said you were going to do? And I mean, I don't exactly know the answer to that right yet. And I think that's what we were sort of thinking. Part of this education period just gets, we start to get the reaction, we're on the right track. Other little things too. I mean, we have a number in there for the police building rent, but there's clearly, you know, I mean, that comes in at some point in time in the future. It's not simultaneous. So, again, for us to be able to say practically when would it happen? How long would it take you to build a police building? That's it. Oh, how long? You know, maybe it's 5 years later we'd say that comes in. People are going to want us to know that we've thought this thing through, and that's the period. That's why the outreach thing is important, and that's why the committee making a recommendation, getting to Larry's question about how soon you come to the council, I think sooner than later is really important.
I have one observation to share with you about the November 14th deadline and the measures that you might be considering in terms of revenue. And some need more outreach than others. The TOT certainly needs outreach with the business community. A sales tax probably needs a lot more outreach than the TOT in terms of intensity of the outreach, because you have more businesses to outreach, and some of the others might even have more outreach as well. And given the, you know, it's helpful to review other efforts in the past to raise certain revenues and the degree of opposition, let's say, in the community. So I think that's an important thing to consider as you begin to look to the November 14th.
So the other thing I was almost done.
I thought you were done.
I was almost done. We also, as a committee, need to make that recommendation. I know Pat's pushed that, and I've agreed with him on it, on the new hotel revenue. I mean, we've got this in as the funding source, and it says, you know, what is it? New hotels, 33.6 million. That's a big part of that funding source, but council hasn't given that direction, and we need to go to council. And in fact, if I recall, me and Pat actually agendized that for a discussion, which never came to council. And so I think we need to make that clear and have an up or down on it, because if council's not going to support that, then there's a $33 million hole in that funding side. So I just wanted to lay that on the table as something else we need to focus on.
Well, I'll start off by saying, in actuality, the council has made no decisions. Just for example, there was mention of the advisory measure to whether we're going to do that or not. And somebody said the council had made that decision. No, it hasn't. It was talked about. So we're writing in some ways on a blank page. We're not overruling, and of course, we can't make any rules anyway, because it all has to go to the council. But if we recommended no advisory measure, for example, that would not be going contrary to the council, because there hasn't been any decisions. And the same thing is true with the use of the new hotel TOT. That's true of everything. And Pat, I think you were referring to the use of a 5-year reserve. There is no 5-year reserve. Were you referring to the money from the new hotels?
I didn't say 5-year reserve.
Yes, you did, but okay.
Oh, the 5-year surplus.
I don't see any 5-year surplus.
It is under, right here, Larry.
Page
It's a
42.
$1 million per year.
He's looking at a different
surplus
page.
over
I thought we were looking on page 43.
42.
42.
This
Oh,
is-
that's it still gets to the same point. One of the things this committee has done is, and the staff has responded positively, is really to integrate the annual capital improvement program and this program, because they are really the same type of thing. And so I think it was appropriate to put that in the same sense that we've added in the $8 million surplus from 2013. And so that we also asked staff, and they have done it, to make sure that we don't have any overlap between the projects that are being funded by the annual program and programs that would be funded by this whatever major program, because the line between the two is not hard and fast. What's a sort of an annual type program, a CAP program, and one that needs a special source of funding? Well, obviously, the public safety building fits that category of being special, but there are a lot of other ones that are more on the borderline. So, okay. Let me respond to my own questions, because I think they're good, and the staff's questions, because I think that we need to move along. I'll start with the schedule. Because I think that, and I'm quite comfortable with some other dates, but if you work back from our final action, probably has to be taken by the last meeting in June, assuming for the moment that we're going to take July off as we did in 2013. That hasn't been decided yet, but if we take off August rather than July, then we have until the end of July to make a decision. The council was asked, I think most members of the council wanted to have more time to consider this, and I can understand that. So I'm working back from the end of June, and I would say council ought to have 2 months or more to fine-tune this, vote on it, debate it, whatever. So that would say that this committee's work ought to be to the council by April 15th or April 30th at the latest. So we've got 90 days or so to finish our work on that. And I think that means you got to start making decisions fairly soon. And I still struggle with when you come, how we're going to handle the public safety building, which is certainly my first priority. I think it's almost everybody's. And also what we're going to do on. But I do want to throw in that I totally agree with Greg that what are we trying to cover? We are trying to cover everything, but it's everything as of now. And are there going to be other things in the future? Sure there are. And the biggest one that I presently could see is some type of transportation demand management program, or a more aggressive parking garage program, which I think we're a long way from deciding. By a long way, maybe at least a year. So that I don't really see I know there's some money in here for that, but whether that's a proper amount, I have no idea. So as I look back on our schedule, working back from the April 15th or April 30th, staff asked us to, does the council, by meaning the committee now, want to proceed with ballot measure preparation and community outreach on a potential measure to increase the city's TOT for the November 14th ballot? my answer is yes. If so, should it be a 2 or 3% increase to the tax? I think it should be 2. I'm willing to defer making a final decision on that, so that if one of my colleagues here has whose initials are GS,
Who strongly thinks it should be 3.
then, but I somehow 2, I think is all we really need, and so 2, does the city council, do we want to proceed with a follow-up survey, et cetera, et cetera? As one of you mentioned, where I think we're really, if we just leave ourselves with the TOT, I think we've done enough survey work, and we can use that savings to finance the public safety building.
Not that expensive.
So the same answer to question number 3. Are there further information needs or further study? I don't think there are any. There'll always be additional information needed. This being the way our city operates, so no on that. But deep studies, I don't think so. I think we're. Though I think there are some next steps, and in my mind, one of the major next steps is for us to finalize a list of priorities, what projects we're really going forward with. And what we would, I think the way to, I'm very much taken with Dave Metz's advice that we not have an advisory measure, and that instead we adopt a plan as to how the money would be used. And I think that's where it's going to be tricky as to what you say about the public safety building. If we're using the money, then you have to have a paragraph that says, what does it say? It says that the city manager has been instructed to go out and find an appropriate site by next week.
Go.
And I think that in our statement or principles or whatever we want to call it to the general public, we would certainly be referring to the IBRIC study and what we've included and what we haven't. And I would see that as having that statement being more complicated, because I think that when we're talking about funding a certain number of these projects from the Stanford money, are we going to identify which ones get financed from the Stanford money and which ones get financed from the TOT money? I don't know the answer to that yet, but I think maybe we have to wrestle with that. Anyway, those are my thoughts as to how we ought to be proceeding. Matt?
So I largely agree with Larry. And just a few follow-up comments. One, on this issue of whether we are at a point on being able to determine what to include and what not to include, I'd put a slightly different spin on it. I think we're actually at a point where we are very close to determining what to definitely include, and what we haven't, we're further away from is what not to include or what to perhaps include. So, and I think separating those two are useful, because the sooner we have clarity to our colleagues so that they can consider it, and to the public, that we put a framework around that says, if we were to say, well, we definitely plan on including fire station rebuildings that are essential, and public safety building, and perhaps we would say, and a downtown garage, or whatever level, and then put this other category of things, and these are the additional items that we may not be able to afford all of them, but this is what we will be debating in the upcoming months. And I think that helps begin to frame it. In that context of the things of what perhaps not to include in this measure, Jim had mentioned Charleston Rastradero Road. Well, one of the things that if we're putting a expenditure plan, which in a way is a form of an advisory measure there, I think it would behoove us to not put highly contentious things there. So that's one. The other is that when I look at the sidewalks issue, I've always lumped the streets and sidewalks together. we have now virtually tripled our streets, and we're moving at a higher pace even than what we had done 2 years ago. And the Weekly got it a little wrong in today's thing on when we started this. We began this in the second half of 2010, where we doubled it. Fiscal year 2011 is when we made the change, and then a second change this last year. Well, when I look at the sidewalk deficit dollars, they're a fraction of what we've already increased to the streets. So I would like to see those funds looked at as a combined streets and sidewalks expenditure, and what's the pace that we do that. And I think that in doing that, we've already upped the investment in that combined category at such a high level that I don't know that the public has much appetite for having more construction on their streets and sidewalks going on at once than they have right now. We're starting to get some pushback there. And we're going to get to our goal line pretty quickly there.
Pat, just a point of clarification. I don't think we're fixing the sidewalks at that rate.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because I was...
No, I didn't say that. That was my point, is that in order for us to look at increasing our sidewalk expenditure rate, the best way to perhaps look at that is look at streets and sidewalks together and the total amount that we have increased in streets and sidewalks. And we've increased our streets expenditure a whole bunch, our sidewalk expenditure only a little bit.
We increased the sidewalk expenditure $1 million a year starting in 2013, and as I reported to the council, we're now doubled the amount of sidewalks we have. Now, the point is, maybe it needs to be quadrupled or quintupled. But anyway.
Yeah, we'll look at that in greater detail, but my gut level is that you can't fix the streets and sidewalks all at once, and it becomes very disruptive. We're starting to make real good headway, and we're going to get to the goal line on both of those. So my point is, I'm not sure that when we look at it in detail, we're going to need to lump it into this. It's more in the category of the ongoing CIP and the commitment we've made there. On the 2 versus 3% TOT increase, I agree with Larry, and I just want to lay out the reasons why. I know that I agree with Councilmember Scharf that we could probably get voter support for a 3%, but I don't want to be that greedy. We basically could do it, but what's the fairness and where do we stand in relation to surrounding communities? If we're at 14%, we're going to be the highest on the peninsula, and we're already on the upper end of that range. And what we saw when we increased it to 12%, at the time we got all this pushback from the hotels, and they basically said it would be the demise of the hotels in the community. We invested in the marketing plan, and they ended up, we see that their demand and their business is more successful than ever. But I don't think Palo Alto wants to be ahead of the highest in that rate. I think that's kind of starts getting into a bad reputation, where we want to have a great reputation as a hotel center. And I'm not sure if it's quite fair. I don't know that substantially it'll be a significant impact, but I think perception-wise, the fairness. And frankly, it seems that over time, throughout the region, we're starting to see TOT increases, and there might be a time, sometime in 5 or 10 years, where other cities have gone up, and we might want to consider upping it another % at that time. And then on the public safety building land issue, we always have had kind of a chicken and egg problem. Do you go out and plop down the money for land and have no money to build it? And we have gone through that process. So so I don't see that as an overwhelming issue. I think that it would be nice if we had the site pretty identified at the time we were voting on this, but I don't think it's a necessity. I think if the voters know that we've got the budget for it, a combination of new revenue and other revenue, and we've finally got the money, and we have put it in an expenditure plan, we're going to build a public safety building, we'll come up with the site. And then finally, there was kind of a question of, what's the everything included? I don't know. This isn't everything, and when we look at the iBrick, it's not everything, what we put on this list. But it is really for what I would say is approximately a 5-year time horizon. It's really our most important things, on top of what we are already making significant progress on, like our streets and elsewhere, and our bike master plan and various other things. So that's how I kind of look at it, and I think that may be something that's worth us discussing so that we frame it, is what is the horizon for these accomplishments? If we get all this done in the next 5 years, that's quite an accomplishment. So that's how I think of it.
Mark?
So I have a lot of thoughts. The first thoughts in regards to outreach, and I guess when I was the one who brought this up at our last council meeting, and in my mind, the sequence was a little different. The sequence was, we identify a couple of options, we do outreach to the business community, get their thoughts on it, and outreach to the broader community, and that's part of our decision making. Not we make the decision and then we go to the to the various stakeholders and say, this is a decision we've made, what do you think? I'm surprised that we didn't have more speakers from the business community here today, because we've received a very few emails. I've seen comments in the press, and we need to hear from people, and we need to hear it publicly, and we need to hear it at these meetings, or else it's very hard for us to make fully informed decisions. So I expected to hear more from folks. Everybody knows that we're discussing this stuff. It's no secret anymore, and I expected to hear more from folks today. If we're going to do a TOT increase, I'd support 2% over 3% for a lot of the reasons that Pat mentioned. I'm still interested in exploring the sales tax scenario for a couple of reasons. The first reason is, for the past 3 years, I've been trying to make sense of the huge puzzle that is the funding resources we have and the projects that we're trying to fund. And to me, you've got a TOT increase, which different people have different opinions on who that most greatly impacts, but the public's going to believe that money's mostly coming from outside sources, and we're looking at that to fund various measures that those outside sources will impact, but they're not the only folks who impact it. A transportation bond would fall solely on residents, and I don't necessarily think that's fair. And a sales tax, to me, seems like that hybrid where the reason that we have increased traffic, the reason that we have parking problems, there are numerous reasons, but a lot of it is folks coming because our commercial corridors are so successful, and a lot of people are coming in to take advantage of that. And those people who are coming in to buy things, helping fund the impacts they're having, seems to make sense to me. Another thing that we need to consider is, on these funding scenarios, and this is one of the reasons why I was frustrated that the sales tax scenario isn't on here, if we're going with a 2% TOT increase, let's say, that means that we're using all $34.4 million of our Stanford funds. And if we're going with the sales tax, and let's say we're going with a 1/4-cent sales tax, we're only using $8 million of the Stanford funds. And depending on if we knock off projects, that could be knocked off completely. And can I get an update from staff on, just because I forget, on generally what the two buckets for the Stanford funds were? I know we have a lot of discretion, but what were the two buckets of the Stanford funds?
More than that, but the two big ones really were, and sort of, we came up with these headings, but they're really even more fungible than this. A $22.1 million bucket called infrastructure/housing.
Housing as in affordable housing? Or?
Well, there had initially been some talk about housing, money for housing, and then the council really said, we don't want to be limited to housing. Actually, we may want to have this for infrastructure. So
sure.
It's really, you could really say it's an infrastructure fund. And then the second one was about $12.3 million in a sustainability bucket to support. But for example, we talked about things like potentially funding the bike and pedestrian master plan out of that. So
Okay.
those are the two biggest biggest pieces?
So, there's a lot of, I think, very good arguments could be made that a lot of the Sanford funds should go to these projects, but I think we just need to realize that that means that it's not going to other things. And that's a discussion that we haven't had at all. In regards to the idea of a legislative advisory memo or whatever the technical term is, if we're doing a 2% TOT increase, that's only $30.8 million. So we don't need to discuss all of the things on the project list necessarily, for that. And I'd argue, I agree that, and I hope we discuss in this committee level soon, like today, the steps we need to move forward with on our new situation with the public safety building, but I don't even know that we need to address a public safety building with this TOT increase, because it's just $30.8 million. With that, you could have the fire stations at 14.2, or parking garages, or these different things could be identified as potential sources, and the public safety building money could come from any of the other funding sources that we have that we don't need voter approval to obtain. I know I know November of 2014 is getting closer, but it's still 10 months away, and I would rather go back out and poll a do additional polling on sales tax increases with maybe different focuses than we had in the last round of polling in terms of the projects, or at least saying in the description the words traffic and parking, which weren't there, and seeing if that changes the results or not. I'd also like to use that time to just personally reach out to the different folks that would be impacted. We're going to do something, and I think we've clearly narrowed it down to, it may at the end of this meeting be one thing. I'd argue we should still be looking at two things, and get input from the folks that are going to be impacted on those two possible options. Going to how we compare to the regions around us, our TOT, we're near the top. SF is 2% higher. Anaheim is 3% higher. I don't really care much about Anaheim. Mountain View is 2% lower. At 10%, but I do agree that over the next couple of years, that's going to move up. Sales tax, most cities in Santa Clara County are 8.75. I think Campbell's a bit higher. All of the San Mateo County cities are at least 9% or higher, and all of the Alameda County cities are at least 9% or higher. And so moving to 9% on sales tax, I think, isn't that great of a disparity with our cities around us. TOT increase, I'd be comfortable with at 2% also, but I just, I'm not convinced yet that, I'm convinced it's the easiest option. I'm convinced we'll be successful, and we could sleep well at night on November or whatever night election day is, but I don't necessarily know yet that that's the best option. So I'd rather do a little more research on sales tax than just narrow us down to one option at this point.
Just one technical thing. We don't have 10 months.
No, election day is 10 months away. I know we don't have 10 months.
We have 6
Absolutely.
months.
Yeah.
Greg?
Well, Mark makes some good points. And that's the reason I support the 3%. I don't think it's a matter of being greedy, Pat. I think it's the issue that we really don't have enough money here. When we look at $33.6 million out of this, it does not produce enough money to feel comfortable that we're going to get a public safety building. They've put down $10 million for land. I'm not sure $10 million for land is going to cut it. I'm not sure that when we go through this and we look at cost overruns and we actually cost it, there's no contingency in here. So when you look at this and you say to yourself, if you bring it right up to the, to the 140 million, or after cutting down some down, or 50 million, we're not going to have enough money. And the difference between 2 and 3% is an extra, what is it, $16 million there? That's a significant, maybe 15 million. It's a significant amount of money that gives you the confidence that we'll actually be able to build the public safety building. And frankly, we've been talking about, Larry probably knows, was it 20 years we've been talking about a public safety? 10 years? Seems forever.
15, 20.
And we never pull it off. And we don't pull it off because we don't make the assumptions that are necessary to get it done. And The difference between the 2 and 3% might very well be, and I think it probably will be, the difference between actually getting that done, the public safety building, and then doing some of these other things. You don't want to go to the public and only do the public safety building after going through this process. And, you know, I think that's really what Mark was saying when he was talking about why sales tax makes more money. It makes more money, and it allows you to not use all the Stanford funds possibly. So I would stick with the TOT, but I would go with 3%. If we go with the 2%, I just don't think we have enough money on it. I don't think it's going to work. So I would go with 3%. The other thing is, I think we should go ahead and direct staff to start working on it and coming up with a plan on a public safety building. If we're serious and it's the #1 priority, we should start that process now.
Sure.
The more information we have, the more staff is out there focusing on how do we put together a public safety building, the more these questions can be asked. And we also will get the numbers right. What's it really going to cost? And, you know, if we don't need the money, then obviously we should go with the 2%. But that, to me, is the issue. Do we need the money or do we not need the money? And it's not just Anaheim. I mean, Santa Monica has a 15%.
Oh, yeah, that's where did you learn that?
I learned that from Councilmember Klein in Santa Monica, and was happy to pay the 15%, and didn't feel like they were being greedy down there.
Well, actually, I stayed there over the Rose Bowl weekend in hotel in Santa Monica, and have the bill right here, and it's 15.5 to be precise.
My goodness. The People's Republic of Santa Monica.
I'm not going to get into that. Plus, they have another 1% for something called, what do they call it?
Healthcare for workers. Yeah.
No. Interesting because of what we've been talking about. It's TMD assessment. Not TDM, but TMD. Another one. So, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. So I guess the question is the public safety building really important to us? And should we go ahead and get staff working on that?
Yes. I think we've already authorized the city manager to do that 10 times over. Don't you regard that as a given?
Well, but without any money, it's kind of a hollow exercise. So pardon me?
Got the money.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, as soon as if we align the numbers up, which it sounds like that's what you've done here, but we could put them all on Richard could put it on a piece of paper just so we're looking at the right things, just to see what's in and what's out.
This is going back way before you came here.
Right.
After all, we had an option on the property.
Oh, no, right, yeah, no, but I was part of that whole option period and stuff. Yeah, no, I know.
So I would ask.
No, I think you have authorized us, but I think you're now talking about how this all fits together with stuff.
So I would like us to defer the decision then on the 2 to 3%. Because if we don't need the money, fine, let's do 2%. But if it does look like we need the money to get this stuff done, then I think we should seriously consider 3%.
That's why I said I
Or
was
sales tax.
willing to see how we fine-tune all of these. So I'm not making a final thing, but I do agree with Pat unless we need the money. But this is what we're going to be doing anyway, is to going through these things on a iterative basis and really fine-tuning it all.
So are you ready for a motion?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I would say that we go ahead and proceed
And then
we narrow it down to that we're going to do the TOT. We proceed with ballot measure preparation and community outreach. We get that process started. We do what we need to do on that. On the TOT, we don't make a decision yet on the 2 to 3%, and that we direct the city manager to start coming up with a plan for getting a public safety building, and we start that process now, and that we don't follow up with any further survey that we would do. And I don't know if I forgot anything. Anyone could add anything?
A list of projects.
In a list of projects.
The other item you might want to consider is the UUT.
Right, and I think we should proceed on the UT modernization, but don't we need some more discussion on that in terms of, I think that,
Well, I think we've had the discussion before, but glad to have it again.
no, I'm happy to just go proceed with it, but I thought we needed to decide if we're going to lower the current cost and go to a flat 5%.
Well, you can bring that up. We haven't.
That's what I meant when I said I
needs to
thought we
be
need more
different
discussion.
Oh, I think we need a lot more discussion on it. I'm not in favor of it, so I would certainly discuss it. But I think the modernization, we've left in the city attorney's hands.
So, council members, we do have a draft in process, and so would look to the committee to direct, should we bring that item back to this committee or straight to the council? And the policy questions would be whether to lower the rate or maintain it, and what to do with the large volume discount, whether to include that. But we can certainly, those are simple drafting matters. We can bring forward a draft that includes those items and highlights the options directly to council if that's the committee's.
Modernization, I think, goes straight to the council.
Yeah, that's not
it's not part of infrastructure, as far as I'm concerned, as to whether we want to play with the rates. That is part of this, and certainly up for discussion. We don't need your input on that because it is a simple drafting matter.
That's correct. So does the council, the committee have a preference on when with that item coming to council? Just, we could bring it within, say, about a month's time, or should it be aligned with the work that's coming out of this committee?
I think it at least should be informed. We don't yet know whether it should be aligned. But if we, as a committee, say at our next meeting, say, all right, we tentatively don't want to have any rate reform, or we tentatively do, then it would very possibly inform the council's decision on going forward with the language reform, and whether they do two things or one thing at a time. So I would recommend that we agendize it.
Align. That's the right answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then
Let's go. Greg is in the process of making a motion.
So I got sidetracked on the UT, but that was the motion. All right, well, we can put the UT.
I'll second that.
I'm in agreement. What is
Confirm. So the direction would be proceed with ballot measure preparation and community outreach on a potential TOT increase, not to decide whether that's 2 or 3 at this point, and not to proceed with any further study on sales tax or geo bond, and direct the city manager to begin preparation of a plan for public safety building.
Correct. And also staff to bring back our list of projects with
Yes.
cost estimates, and, so that we can figure out a priority. Did you want to speak to your motion?
I think we've spoken. I think that's a good way to proceed. I mean, I think those are the issues on the table.
Just on the one item of contingency, I agree that that's an important consideration. I look forward when we bring back the project list, because when I do my math, I see that we already have the potential to have a contingency if some of these things are not included in the scenario. So I think we stand a good chance that we'll be able to address both issues.
Mark?
I'd like to offer an unfriendly amendment that we add in, that while we're doing all of those things, we also add in further study and review of a sales tax increase as listed on number 2 of the staff report.
Don't hear any seconds. So.
Fair enough. Yep.
Are we ready to vote? All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Okay. Next meeting. Jim, you look like you have something to...
Well, no, I don't know if this is, if the committee wants to hear this. I just had a little exchange here with the... Pardon me? I didn't?
You did. Yeah.
Okay. With some IBREC members, I think there was a little concern about maybe some of the assumptions the staff had in some of the revenue yielding methodology, and I just thought before we left that maybe we just if we're sort of thinking we've got something in balance, if we're mistaken or anything like that, I think it would be good to hear. if you guys are
Sure. I
okay.
mean, if somebody thinks the numbers are wrong, that's,
Well, there's three
particularly
questions.
Steve Levy. that
Okay,
we have to
okay,
deal with.
wait a minute, okay. There's a mixture of politics and the numbers, so I went to the Chamber's Business Policy Committee on Wednesday, and they have recommended to their board that they vigorously oppose, which is why I kind of talked to Mark, and Mark wanted to keep the sales tax measure up, okay?
But they oppose what?
So that's just a political thing that you have to figure out what you want to
They
do.
oppose what?
Oppose the TOT vigorously,
TOT.
okay? And they will argue not the question posed by your consultant, but the actual argument that I would argue that your consultant should go back out and test, which is that many of the visits are not paid for by customers going to the Rose Bowl, but are paid for by companies here who can shift to Mountain View or Menlo Park. So that's one piece. Second, I don't know, Joe, whether in considering a 2 or 3% increase, the staff considered any diminution to the existing pot of revenue. Normally, when you have a big tax increase, it's different from your neighbors. You kind of offset that with some loss of business. And I don't know whether the staff.
I think I did throw in a little for a loss of business, but we really didn't experience any major tail off, if you want me to answer that question, tail off when we increased it the last time. There will be debate about the sensitivity. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just, fine. So you've got, whether you want to test the actual opposition that was going to be there and not the opposition that you already tested, that everybody thinks somebody else is going to pay. Second, whether you're going to lose any money. In the staff report, you've cleaned it up a little, but the presentation lumped the 3 new hotels with the 2% increase, and it made it look a little bit larger, and you'll never get away with that.
They've been separated out.
What?
They've been separated consistently.
Well, fine.
They are. They're up there
And the
separate.
final thing, okay, which you really ought to consider is, remember the GMO campaign and the cigarette tax campaign? And all of those consultants who got paid a lot more than your guys got paid, and it started at 70% or 80%. So I'm not sure, as a resident here, I would share your success in thinking that that original polling result before opposition and before a campaign, given that for any big deal, if somebody opposes it, an oil tax, a cigarette tax, a GMO campaign, that the 70% disappears. So, I don't know. I talked with Mark. I would have kept both alive. The last arithmetic is that if you spend $100 at a hotel and the tax goes up $3, 3%, that's $3. If you spend $100 at a restaurant or a retail store, and the sale tax goes up 0.25%, that's 25 cents on $100. I don't know. You don't think you can convince people, half of whom are out of town, spending money, that a 25% on $100 should at least be considered, along with $3 on a $100 bill? But I would have done what Mark did. I would have talked to the chamber and done the outreach and the testing first before you decided that only one was viable.
And quickly, for the record, Steve and I did have a conversation. I always enjoy having conversations with Steve. I came into that conversation with that exact same thought, and his opinion only, further emphasized my belief. It didn't necessarily, make me think that.
Yeah, I don't want us to go, this is a revert, one of the things I hate, is have a vote and then have a further discussion. We should have had this discussion before we took the vote.
But, look, Larry, as a public member, who's asked to speak at the beginning of the meeting.
Exactly. That's exactly.
You don't know
We have very informal, anyway.
what's coming up. So
Great, thanks. Larry?
it's a double bind, Larry.
Okay. So just a couple of comments. I do recall that on the last TOT measure increase, the concern of whether corporate travel and bookings to hotels would be negatively impacted was raised at that time. And it was really the strongest argument against that TOT increase. And I think, as Joe said, we ended up seeing that it didn't come to fruition, that it was a concern. That was probably, in my mind, the most compelling argument. It wasn't overriding, and then in the end, we had an increase in demand, especially after we did the marketing program. Second, I would be interested, though, Steve spoke about possible dilution of support, but we last time, when I'm forgetting by what percentage did the last TOT
I don't exactly remember, but it was above the 2/3, way above the 2/3. Like, I'm sorry.
over 70%.
Over 70%.
Maybe for the next meeting, if we have any history of how it polled initially, and then how it ended up going at the ballot. And then finally on sales, the same argument around possible business impact does exist there. It's not that people are not going to go to our restaurants because of a 0.25% sales tax, but the big ticket items, either business to business or cars. And those decisions very much are corporate decisions that are based upon the point of sale is influenced by the sales tax. Those are deliberate decisions, whereas I'm never going to decide whether I shop at a local retail store based on an 1/8 or a 0.25% difference in sales tax. Big ticket items, yes. And business to business, they have options on where they can often locate point of sale.
Can I offer one other observation, and with all due respect to Councilmember Berman and to Steve, you do experience, in terms of leakage, you note that the internet sales went up by 10%, and we don't at this stage get a lot of those internet sales on the tax on a local basis. Even Amazon is paying, but we're not seeing the direct results of that yet. So as the internet sales go up, as opposed to the brick and mortar sales, you do experience, we can experience a lot of leakage in that area. And not to say we won't experience leakage in the TOT, although the information, given what Councilmember Burt just said, we didn't experience as much on that. It was more the recession that we took the hit on, but everything is fairly robust right now, very robust, as a matter of fact, on the TOT side.
I'll chat with Pat after.
So can I just make a concluding comment just to make sure in advance of your setting the next meeting that we are, again, just roughly on the same page? Everybody's been doing the math and everything, but because there's still other things that could change. I mean, there are things that are on the list that you may ultimately say take off, or there may things that somehow need to be put into it, whether it's on the revenue or on the expenditure side of things. But real quickly up there, just taking the simplest, in my view, the simplest revenues that you identified, the TOT at 2% is 30.8. The new hotel revenue, these are obviously the COP yields. And just taking the 2013 surplus, the Stanford Sustainability, Stanford Infrastructure money, and the police lease, that's $126.9 million. So if you threw the 2014 in, then that's something else, all those things. On the flip side, not saying that this is right, if you took Charleston Rastradero out and just one of those parking garage estimates pieces, you're at 125 million bucks. So obviously, as we look at adding some other revenues, whether that's this or like the TOT or whatever, obviously it gives you an expenditure flexibility. And I'm trying to get at, this is sounding like this is pretty much the council able to answer we're being responsive to the infrastructure needs as we've defined them. And then one last thing I wanted to say, based on what maybe sounded like an offhanded comment that Councilmember Klein made during this session, but we have made improvements on the CIP. One of the things that I will be really asking the staff to do, though, this year when we bring the CIP forward to the council is that we really are thoughtful about how we're presenting what we're going to be spending and investing over the next 5 years, because a lot of that is supplemental to what we're talking about here on this infrastructure measure. So it's ultimately a bigger piece of the, more things are being taken care of than just the things on this list, and I think it'll be important to be able to show that, folks, too. Thanks.
Okay, anything else? The schedule.
I'm bringing up Richard since this is Sheila's last meeting, and as you go to a new schedule, Richard will be staffing Infrastructure Committee. Hopefully, some loss there in some ways, but experienced fellow supporting the committee and everything, I think, and he's happy to be doing this, so I did want him up here, Richard.
Well, given the directions we've made to staff here today, what's your recommendation?
Can I ask a process question? Does this go to council now? The recommendation that we just made doesn't get decided by the full council?
Oh, it most certainly does, but we're not, that was what I said.
Oh, so the 2 to 3% is what we need to discuss now? Is that what you're... And, okay.
No, we're going to pack this guy.
Okay.
That was what I talked about earlier about.
I don't have the motion in front of me. What do you guys estimate?
I guess one concern that I might express is that if we do that at that point, the council has no ability at all to consider other options.
Check-in.
Yeah.
Like that earlier check-in on the sales tax, 2 or 3%.
Yep.
And so when we think of schedule, should we consider that maybe not after this meeting, but after this next coming meeting, we go to council for a check-in?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Did I miss an assignment that I needed to factor in on when we come back? We okay?
No, just after the next meeting, we go to council and have them.
Oh, okay, fine.
Decisions are not ready.
So we were thinking the first week in February sometime, end of January, first week in February.
I was thinking 3 weeks, so that's all the same thing.
The last week of January.
Okay, so that might be actually better.
Yes, for me too.
So are we going to meet at Friday at 11? Is there a reason, as opposed to Friday at 10? Because we don't miss lunch. I start to get hungry. 9's fine too. I just,
No, I don't know, the staff goes Thursday, whatever.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be a Friday. I mean, just sort of. You obviously have a special meeting on the 27th. So we do Wednesday the 29th, Thursday the 30th. You don't want to do the 30th? Or the...
How about Friday at 10 or 9?
It's 9:80, but...
Oh, it's a 9:80?
How about the 29th?
So let's not do a 9:80.
Wednesday the 29th? Okay.
Yeah.
What time do you, what,
I'd like to do 9.
9?
Sure.
9 o'clock work for you all?
Okay. 129 or 9?
Yes, that's fine, I guess.
129.
Okay. Anything else? Meeting adjourned.
Great.
All right.